Whether you're a new or advanced gardener, you're probably looking into starting the most popular crop in the garden, and that's tomatoes. So in today's video, we're going to be breaking down everything there is to know about getting your tomato seeds off on the right foot so that we have large, healthy transplants for our garden later on this season. Now, before we actually get into planting these tomato seeds, we need to go over a few things first, starting with choosing the right varieties, not only based on your preference, but on your climate and where you live. There are thousands of varieties out there, and it's super easy to get overwhelmed and confused. So to make things easier, I'm going to actually break down the different categories and the different things that really are deciding factors when it comes to choosing the right varieties for your climate. Now, really the first thing to consider is choosing varieties that will actually grow in your climate. There are varieties out there that can take anywhere from 80 to 100 days to mature and actually give you fruit. Varieties like Black Beauty, Afternoon Delight, Brandywine, and Green Giant. These are all longer maturing varieties. They're larger tomatoes, and they just take much longer to mature than some of your other smaller varieties. Things like grape, cherry, and some of your smaller slicing varieties generally take much less time, and you can find varieties that mature in as little as 60 to 70 days. So this is super important because if you're trying to grow a longer maturing variety that takes 70, 80, 90 days to mature, and you only have a growing season of around 60 days, or let's say somewhere in that range, you're not going to be able to grow that variety. This becomes super important because if you live in a zone that does not have the required amount of growing days for the tomato variety that you're trying to grow, you're never going to see the tomatoes off of that plant, and that is just going to end up taking space in your garden, and it's really just something you want to avoid. So the only way to do that is to do your research and to check into whatever varieties you're growing, how long they take to mature. The next thing to consider when choosing the right tomato varieties for you can really be broken up into two different categories, with the first being indeterminate varieties and the second being determinate varieties. Now, determinate varieties are varieties that get to a certain height, usually around 3 to 5 feet, and then stop putting out their leaf growth and start putting all of their energy into setting their fruit at one time. This is especially important, and a lot of these varieties are mainly used for things like canning because it makes it much easier for the people to be able to do all of their canning necessary at one point instead of throughout the season. These varieties are perfect when it comes to container gardening or just gardening on a smaller scale because they're not going to get super tall. They're not going to just completely take over. They're going to stay smaller, more compact, making them a much better option for a lot of areas. You also don't need to prune these varieties and do a lot of the things that you would have to do with indeterminate varieties, making them a much better option when it comes to ease and maintenance. Indeterminate varieties, on the other hand, are varieties that just do not stop growing. They will continue to grow throughout the season, sometimes getting upwards of 7 feet tall if you let them, and they will continue to produce that fruit throughout the season instead of producing it all at one time like the determinate varieties do. These varieties are perfect for spacing out your harvest instead of giving it to you all at one time like the determinate varieties would. But there are some downsides to these varieties. For example, if you don't keep them pruned and maintained, they can often get very out of control quickly, a lot of times bringing in unwanted pests and diseases, and they can also do things like block out the sun from other plants that you're trying to grow. Now, of course, whether you decide to go with indeterminate or determinate varieties is completely up to you, but depending on what route you take really does depend on what you are growing the tomatoes for. So if you're growing tomatoes and you want them all at one time and you want plants that stay smaller, more compact, much easier to maintain, I definitely go down the determinate route. Whereas if you want larger plants that do take more work but give you a much larger harvest that spans throughout the growing season, I definitely go with your indeterminate varieties. By the way, if any of these tomato seeds that we've talked about so far interests you, or if you're just looking for a larger selection of tomato seeds, I definitely check out our website. I'll leave a link in the description below to where you can find it. But we've got an awesome selection of rare, open pollinated, heirloom tomato seeds, meaning that you can save the seeds for many years to come. And we've just got an awesome selection. So if you're looking for some new varieties and you want to give any of these that we've talked about a shot, I definitely check it out. Okay, the next thing that we're going to cover when it comes to starting your tomato seeds is timing and when you should start them indoors. Tomatoes are warm season crops, meaning that they cannot take a frost. If your tomato plants experience any type of frost at all, they're often going to become severely damaged, stunted, or in most cases, just die off completely. So we really don't want that. And to make sure that this does not happen, you really want to plant your tomato seedlings outside around 2 weeks after your average last frost date. Your average last frost date can be found in a number of places, but to make things easy, I will leave a link in the description below to where you can find your average last frost date based on where you live and what your climate is like. Now, when starting your tomato seeds, you really want to give them at least 6 to 8 weeks indoors before you decide to go plant outdoors. So when saying this, because we want to give that extra 2-week gap after your average last frost date, you want to count back 6 to 8 weeks before that point. So if your average last frost date, let's say, is May 15th, you want to count back 6 to 8 weeks behind that date, just to make sure that you have enough time to get established healthy transplants, but also to make sure that you are not experiencing that frost that could damage and kill your plants that you've worked so hard to get healthy and to get growing for your garden. If you live in a climate that has a shorter growing season, you can start your tomato seeds indoors earlier than that 6 to 8 week point. I actually start all of mine indoors 10 weeks before I go to plant outdoors, just to make sure that I have much larger, healthier established plants to move outdoors. But this is completely optional and is just something that I do, but you really don't need to do it. But if you are trying to grow a variety that you may not have enough time at the 6 to 8 week point, you can try 10 weeks, 12 weeks. But again, if you do that, you're going to need larger pots, you're going to need more space. So however much time you give, just be prepared that you are going to need all of this extra stuff if you do decide to go that route. All right, now that all of that back info is out of the way, it's finally time to start our tomato seeds indoors. But before we do so, we first need to select our container. Of course, selecting what you're going to start your seeds in is completely up to you. You can start all of your seeds in these larger containers. You will need more space doing this, more grow lights, depending on how many you grow, because these are larger than these. But I will say that you won't need to do that transition period of potting up your seedlings from the smaller cells to the larger containers. But I actually recommend starting your tomato seedlings in these smaller cells. I say that because once the seeds start to sprout and once you get those larger transplants, all down that tomato stem is little hairs that, when exposed to the soil and moisture, will actually create and turn into roots. So once you go to transplant them out of these cells and move them into the larger containers, you can actually bury most of that stem underneath the soil, which in return will turn into new roots, which will give you a much more established root ball, which in return will give you a much larger, much healthier tomato plant. So that's just a tip that I've learned, that I've used, that I've found helpful, but you wouldn't be able to do that if you just started them in these larger containers. Okay, before you could start any types of seeds, you have to start with some type of growing medium. And I've talked about this a lot in my other videos, but I always recommend seed starting mix. Now, I recommend seed starting mix because it is super lightweight, it's super fluffy, meaning that those seeds can break through to the surface fairly easily in this stuff, but also the roots can get very much so established in this, and it does not take too much work for them to do that. So I always recommend seed starting mix. You can go to the store, you can buy it pre-made, or you can make your own. I just did a video on choosing the best seed starting mix or choosing the best soil for starting seeds. So if you're interested in that, definitely go and check that video out. Also, seed starting mix has little to no nutrients in it, which is perfect for starting seeds indoors. Seeds, believe it or not, have all of the nutrients they need in the seed coat to keep the plants alive for the first few weeks of their growth. So if your seed starting mix has nutrients in it, a lot of times it's going to burn your baby plants, and it's just something you really don't want. So it's better to start with a growing medium that does not have any nutrients in it, that's very sterile, and then gradually add those nutrients in as your plants grow. Okay, I know I'm going to make a huge mess here, but we're just adding this to the cells. And again, like I said earlier in this video, I highly recommend starting them in the smaller cells and then gradually potting them up into the larger containers. Because those roots are going to start forming on the tomato stem, you really want to be able to plant that stem underneath the soil every time you go to pot up into the new container. So again, just start them in these smaller cells if you can. If you can't, it's really not that big of a deal, but I do find the biggest success doing it this way. I will add in also that when using seed starting mix, always make sure that it is pre-moistened. If you try to put just dry seed starting mix in your cells, it will get very overwhelming. The water does not want to go through. It kind of just makes a nasty puddle of water and seed starting mix, and it just overall makes a huge mess. So make sure that your seed starting mix is pre-moistened. And when I say that, you really want it to where when you squeeze it, only a few drops come out. You don't want it soaking wet. You don't want it soggy, because if your seed starting mix is soggy and you're trying to germinate your tomato seedlings, they're very susceptible to what's called damping off, which is basically where the roots just get constricted. They don't have, or the roots just kind of lose oxygen, and then they just start rotting underneath the ground, and you really don't want that. So make sure that your soil is moist but not soaking wet, and that your seed starting mix is pre-moistened prior to planting. After you've placed the seed starting mix in the cells, just go through, press it down, make sure that it's not super compact, but not super airy at the same time. So usually when you place it one time, just give it a nice press just once into the cells and then recover, and that should be fine. You really want a nice block of soil that your roots can attach to. If it's super airy and only half of these cells are filled up with soil because you didn't press them down, those roots are not going to have a lot of soil to attach to, and it can cause some issues later on when you're trying to transplant. Tomato seeds really germinate best at around 65 to 75 degrees. Usually you can germinate tomato seeds just fine in pretty much any house, just the room temperature, but they can take 7 to 14 days if you go that route. A much quicker, faster method is using a heat mat, putting a humidity dome over this, putting this on a heat mat, and your seeds can start germinating in as little as 3 to 5 days. So that really does speed up the process for tomato seeds. Again, you don't have to. That does cost a little more for all of that equipment, but it's what I use, and I think it helps really well when it comes to getting your seeds germinating fast. All right, now it's time to get these seeds planted into these cells. So when you're planting tomato seeds, you want to make sure that you put at least 2 to 3 seeds per cell. You don't want to be waiting on if you only plant one seed per cell, waiting for that one seed to germinate. And if it doesn't, then you're just wasting space and wasting those cells. So just make sure that you plant 2 to 3 seeds per cell to make up for those ones that don't sprout. Once these seeds do start to sprout, you don't want to give these any fertilizer for around, I'd say, 2 to 3 weeks after they sprout. You really want to wait until those seedlings start to develop their first set of true leaves. After those first set of true leaves have developed and you start seeing that second set of true leaves starting to pop out, that's when you can really give these seeds or these seedlings their first dose of fertilizer. When you're fertilizing, make sure that you do well with whatever fertilizer that you're using. Make sure that you do it at half strength. You don't want to give these seedlings a full dose of that fertilizer. Otherwise, you're running the risk of burning your plants or stunting them. So just make sure that with whatever fertilizer you're using, that you're doing it at half strength. So for example, if your fertilizer instructions say 1 tablespoon per gallon of water, make sure that you're doing half of that. Most of the time, just a little bit of fertilizer goes a long way, especially when these are just starting to grow. Once you move them outside, once you get them into the soil, you can change that and you can do full strength. By that point, these plants will be able to take it. But until then, just doing a half strength of the fertilizer really does it all. Okay, after these have been planted, all you're going to do is just push them down about 1/4 inch deep. Tomato seeds are pretty resilient and they're going to sprout, or they're going to try their best to sprout. So if you plant them deeper, it's not too much to worry about. But anywhere between 1/4 and 1/2 inch deep is perfect for planting your tomato seeds. Okay, and then just kind of lightly cover them, and you're good to go. Just remember that with whatever seeds you're starting, always make sure to label. This is a huge step because you may think, if you walk away and come back, you're going to remember what you planted, but trust me when I say this, you won't. I've planted tons of plants, and I've lost some plants just because I can't remember what variety I planted. This is especially important if you're planting multiple varieties because all tomato seedlings look the same, so you really won't be able to tell from variety to variety what you planted. So you can bypass all of these issues, all of these problems, just by labeling. So I'm labeling this variety, and this variety is called Black Beauty. It's the darkest tomato in the world so far. Unless it's been beat, I don't think it has. It is at this time the darkest tomato in the world. It's a very delicious slicing tomato. We actually have seeds available at our seed shop for this tomato, so if you want to get your hands on it, definitely check out our seed shop. It's an amazing variety. We grow it every year. We have been for the last 3 years now, and then again this year. So if you want your hands on this variety, definitely get your seeds at our seed shop. And that's it when it comes to starting your tomato seeds indoors. If you enjoyed this video or learned something new, please give it a like and make sure that you subscribe, because once all these seeds start to sprout, you're going to need to know the next step on keeping these alive, keeping them healthy throughout the growing season, and we'll have videos coming on all of that and more. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.